rise once again to draw the attention of my colleagues and the American people to Afghanistan. I say once again because over my 20-year career in Congress, I have spoken many times and at great length about that distant and desolate country. My interest and involvement in Afghanistan, in fact, date back before I was elected to Congress. During the 1980s, I was a special assistant to President Ronald Reagan. While I was primarily a speechwriter, I soon learned after arriving at the White House with Reagan's team at the beginning of his administration that the president's words, once spoken and in the record, become the policy of the executive branch. As a speechwriter, I not only would write the words but would help determine what would be said. When I realized the influence I would have, I was in awe of where my life had led me. I had worked hard in Ronald Reagan's gubernatorial campaigns when he first ran for governor back in California. Later on, I worked with the presidential campaigns when Ronald Reagan ran for president in 1976 and 1980, and when he won in 80, I went with him to the White House. And I am still honored that President Reagan brought me to the White House with him and that he trusted me enough to hold such a position of writing his words and working with him on his speeches. And often enough, I really appreciate the fact that often enough, President Reagan backed me up when the remarks that I wrote were a little bit tougher than the policy statements that most of the senior staff of the White House wanted the president to say. But I worked for President Reagan. I knew that. I didn't work for his staff. I worked for him. And I understood he wasn't there to be president. He was there to make things happen, to change the course of our country, to redirect the confidence of our people from a downward spiral at that time to an upward thrust. Those of us who worked for him knew firsthand that an unmistakable goal to which President Ronald Reagan was committed was to bring about a more peaceful world. That lofty goal was not going to be achieved by ignoring or downplaying threats, or by sincere expressions of a desire for peace, or by holding hands and singing Kumbaya. Yes, part of Reagan's strategy was to obtain a more peaceful world was rebuilding our military forces, this to deter aggression. But let us look back and note, he rebuilt our military forces, but only on rare occasion did President Reagan send our troops into troubled spots in the far reaches of the world. He was hesitant to give the green light to use the military in such actions. He did so sparingly. He had a sense not to get us trapped into a prolonged conflict or a no-win situation. He sent our Marines to Lebanon for a specific mission. They were there to accomplish that mission, and they were supposed to leave within days. Then President Reagan was convinced, over his better judgment, to keep the Marines in that war-torn city, Beirut, as a stabilizing force. Get that, a stabilizing force in the most volatile region of the planet. The result was, of course, 295 dead Marines. A setback for our country, but a catastrophe for 295 American families who lost loved ones. It was especially hurtful to me. I grew up in a Marine family. My father was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps. And I went to school and lived in Camp Lejeune and Cherry Points, North Carolina, when I was in 8th and 9th and 10th grade. There, my brother, who was also going to school with me, met and befriended, a man who became his best friend, in fact, David Battle, who shortly after graduating from Camp Lejeune High School, joined the Marine Corps. He was still 17 years old. Sergeant David Battle remained my brother's best friend, and as Ronald Reagan was being inaugurated right afterwards, we went to Camp Lejeune, and we visited with his family and with David Battle. He was a sergeant at that time. He'd been in the Marines all that time, 2 tours of duty in Vietnam, and he was looking forward in a few years ahead to retiring from the Marine Corps, and there he had a small boat which he was going to be working the rivers and estuaries in North Carolina, collecting seafood and oysters and clams He had his life picked out for him. It was going to be a fine retirement. We were very close to that family. And then I went up and joined the White House staff. A few years later, when the bomb went off in the Marine barracks in Beirut, killing 295 of our people, I immediately sought out the list of casualties, and Sergeant David Battle, his name, was the first on the list of those who'd been killed. I went to my office in the White House and I wept. And at that point, I pledged to myself that I would never, ever cease to step forward and try to make sense of something that that didn't make sense and that would put our people in jeopardy. President Reagan learned a bitter lesson, and to his credit, against the advice of some very aggressive national security advisors, President Reagan decided not to reinforce the decimated Marine force in Lebanon. Instead, he pulled them out before we got stuck in a quagmire that would have been exploited by our major global enemy at that time, the Soviet Union. He took great care not to get us into a fight that we wouldn't be able to get out of. Let me note, for all the name-calling suggesting Ronald Reagan was a warmonger for building up our nation's military, Reagan's predecessors, both Republican and Democrat, sent our military into action far more often than did President Reagan. The liberation of Grenada was from a bizarre and murderous communist takeover, and that was just a very small, short operation, and in Lebanon, which turned out so badly. That's about as far as it goes in terms of Ronald Reagan ordering U.S. troops into harm's way. So sending American combat troops into battle was not how Ronald Reagan succeeded in making the world a safer place, a world where universal peace would have a chance. Well, number one, to accomplish that, Ronald Reagan built up our military might in weapons, quality of personnel, and advanced technology. For example, his famous commitment to a missile defense system, which even today looks like such an important investment to protect us against missiles from Korea or Iran or perhaps China. He improved our intelligence, which had been gutted in the 1970s. And lastly, and most importantly, by implementing a strategy that became known as the Reagan Doctrine, he helped end the reign of communist tyranny and made the world a safer place. It was Charles Krauthammer who first identified that Reagan's words and actions were part of a comprehensive strategy being brought to bear against Soviet communism, a strategy that had been outlined in his speeches. The Reagan Doctrine had nothing to do with sending U.S. troops to far-off lands and defeating an enemy. Reagan instinctively knew there were limits to what the power of government, even the Army, could accomplish. But he also understood the mighty power of people who love freedom. Ronald Reagan understood that struggling against tyranny, especially communist tyranny, were America's greatest allies. They would be our brothers and sisters throughout the world of people who are resisting tyranny, especially communist tyranny. The Reagan Doctrine, in short, was to achieve our goals of a safer world and a more secure world and a safer and more secure America by supporting those brave souls in various countries who were resisting or fighting pro-Soviet communist dictatorships, which was our enemy as well as their oppressor. In Poland, we covertly helped the Solidarity movement. We bolstered our broadcasting to captive nations in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. We provided funds and resources to the anti-Sandinista insurgents in Nicaragua, which eventually forced that Marxist gangster regime to have a free election. And when they did, those Sandinistas, those Marxist Sandinistas, lost overwhelmingly. The implementation of the Reagan Doctrine, not just rebuilding U.S. military strength, was what broke the will and the bank account of the Soviet Union. Nowhere was it more effective and harder fought than in Afghanistan, which in the mid-1980s was in the front lines of the Cold War. A few years into the Reagan administration, I was approached by an old friend, Dr. Jack Wheeler, who, interestingly enough, was the chairman of Youth for Reagan in Ronald Reagan's first campaign for governor in California back in 1966. That's where I met